The effect of COVID-19 on public health around the world has been stark, some 4 million fatalities. But what's been its effect on the world's conflicts? The Institute for Economics and Peace publishes the annual Global Peace Index. The 2021 index shows COVID has actually lessened violence in the world's traditionally troubled areas, the Middle East and North Africa. But it's increased strife in the US. Australian businessman Steve Killelea is founder of the Institute.
Well, what we found initially, it actually had an effect on dampening violence. So you found things like violent demonstrations decrease, the level of violent crime, homicides, they all fell. And obviously there were other things which were offset, like increases in domestic violence. But what we found as 2020 moved on, violent crime and homicides, violent demonstrations started to move back to their old levels. Now, the areas where we've seen that the COVID has impacted the most has really been in the levels of violent demonstrations. There are over 5,000 incidences globally which were related to COVID lockdowns and other measures. The areas where this was the largest in the world was actually in India, followed by the United States, then areas of Europe as well. But the real effect from COVID-19 will come through the economics, depending on whether the economies are capable of recovering globally. That'll come back and affect political instability and also violent demonstrations. So the next 2 to 3 years are where we really expect to see the long-term impacts of COVID-19 in terms of conflict and violence play out.
When you talk about 5,000 violent incidents due to COVID, give us the idea of the spectrum here, because I suspect they don't all look the same.
These range from demonstrations against lockdowns, other ones related to economic austerity in some areas, and we can also move into what we could see as the hate crimes related to COVID. That's where these are incidences we're talking about rather than demonstrations. So you see a number of incidences related to this as well, which would see people getting violent over being told to wear masks or having their personal freedoms restricted in some shape, way or form.
There's another interesting finding that in the past year, the biggest improvements have actually taken place in, paradoxically, the least peaceful parts of the world. Where are you talking about?
Yes, well, this is true. If we look at the 5 countries at the bottom of the Global Peace Index, 4 of them actually improved. The only one to deteriorate was Yemen. And if we look at Afghanistan, even Afghanistan improved slightly with less deaths from terrorism and less deaths on the battlefield. Biggest improvement was in Iraq. So Iraq jumped quite remarkably in its levels of peace. So that is a change from the patterns of the last decade. So we went back for the last decade, we had this concept of this rising inequality in global peace. So what we're finding is the countries at the top were becoming more peaceful, whereas ironically the countries at the bottom were becoming less peaceful. And this change in many ways has come about because of the defeat of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and these countries are still highly stressed, but they're improving. And then the imminent withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. That's while they've been going through the peace discussions there, or the withdrawal discussions, the Taliban have lessened their attacks somewhat.
So what are the countries at the top of your index? They won't surprise us, but it's nonetheless fascinating to think about them. What are they?
Well, if we go that back, we find Iceland is right at the very top.
Most peaceful.
Most peaceful. It's followed by New Zealand, then Denmark and Portugal. Now, what we've got is 8 of the 10 top countries in the world are actually in Europe. And that's the largest ever. In the past years, it's been 6 to 7. But we've just found that Singapore has just dropped out of the top 10 this year. So what it shows is, obviously the structures and the way those countries work create high levels of peace. As also, you'll find all those countries are very well-performing economies. This brings us back to the relationship between peace and economic prosperity. And at two angles I can come at this from. One is looking at from the measures of the Global Peace Index, or the concept, which I mentioned earlier, on positive peace. And I think that's, in some ways, is a better way of looking at this, because this looks at the underlying structures of societies which create peace. But those same structures also create other things which we think are really important, like higher per capita income, better performance on the measures of the ecology, measures of well-being and happiness are higher, and also measures of inclusion, all sorts of different ways, including gender. So in many ways, when you look at this positive peace, it describes an optimal environment which human potential can flourish. But if we just go back to the economic argument again, so countries which are improving in positive peace have 3 times higher GDP growth rate than ones which are deteriorating. Their interest rate and inflation rates are lower. In fact, the inflation rates are 7 times less volatile. They do better for foreign direct investment. It's twice as high.
What does the index tell us, Steve, about countries that are at peace and how they have weathered COVID compared with those countries that are convulsed by violence or upheaval? I mean, what is the economic difference there? Because there's some fascinating figures.
Let's start with the big picture. And if we look at the cost of violence to the global economy, it's about $15 trillion in 2020. That's equivalent to 11.6% of global GDP.
Yeah, let me just say that again. $15 trillion is the cost of violence.
11.6% the global GDP, just to reinforce it. And that's a conservative number because we can only count what we can count. The actual effect's higher. So we looked at the 10 countries most affected by violence, and generally all in a war zone. It costs 36% of their national GDP. If we look at the 4 countries least affected by violence, and 8 of the 10 of them are in Europe, that's down to 4% of GDP. So the rest of the world's moving somewhere between those figures. When we look at COVID, for example, what we can find there's this concept called positive peace, and that's the structures which create for peaceful society. So by measuring them, we can now see how those countries compared to other countries. And what we found is the ones which were highest in these measures of positive peace, and we're just looking at the OECD countries here, they had much lower unemployment rates moving through 2020 than the countries with lower levels of this measure of positive peace, or the measure of the factors which create for peaceful societies. So there's quite a stark difference.
I want to talk about positive peace later on, but just to put a figure on it, you say that high peace countries lost only about 7% of their working hours due to COVID. Low peace countries lost 23% of their working hours. You also have a warning about the United States and its internal peace structures, about its internal peace, don't you?
Yes, so if we go back and look at the US, we went back over the last decade, it had the 6th largest drop in positive peace globally. It's still reasonably high on positive peace, but it's the areas where you're finding it's decreasing are concepts like fractionalised elites. That's where the elites within a society start to fight amongst themselves. You could see this particularly through the Trump era in the US, and the inability of the Democrats and Republicans to agree on much at all. Even the last election results were highly contested. You've got group grievances, which are on the increase, perceptions of corruption on the increase, particularly between business and politics, and that's pretty much true right through most of the Western countries these days, but the US, it's even stronger. We've also had an erosion of working conditions and also wages over the last 15 years in the US, and that also now comes through in a whole lot of the civil unrest, which takes many different shapes and forms.
Yeah, this is the Religion and Ethics Report with Andrew West, and I'm speaking with Steve Killelea. Steve is the founder of the Institute for Economics and Peace, and every year Steve releases his annual Peace Index, the Global Peace Index, and we're also discussing Steve's current book, Peace in the Age of Chaos, the best solution for a sustainable future. Yeah, and of course the world, as you say, doesn't necessarily put a premium on peace. What did you measure, for example, to be the global cost of conflict just a couple of years ago? It was a staggering figure.
Yeah, I think it was about 600 billion. That's an awful lot of money, but 600 billion is, when we're looking at 15 trillion, it's only a small part of it. The largest expense actually goes on military. And so with 40% of that model, which came in at $15 trillion, is on the military.
Steve, you've talked a lot and you've made a lot of references to positive peace. And there are, I think, 8 pillars of positive peace. I can't go through all of them. But first of all, when we talk about positive peace, how is it different from what we might call negative peace? I mean, I think negative peace is simply the absence of conflict. It's just maybe tamping things down with what, never resolving anything?
That's true, Andrew. So if we look at it, we look at negative peace, and the Global Peace Index is a negative, what's termed a negative measure of peace. So that's the absence of violence, the fear of violence. And that's really important because it does give you the state of where things are, and it gives you where the most worst areas for society in terms of its violence. But it doesn't tell you how to go about creating peaceful society. So that's where positive peace comes in.
Yeah, you've talked about a couple of the pillars. You've referred to them: a sound business environment and high levels of human capital. I want to ask you about another couple that you emphasise here: the equitable distribution of resources and, for example, acceptance of other people's rights. Just expand upon those two, because they are key as well.
Sure. So there's 8 pillars. They all interact together as a system. What happens is, if we're looking at equitable distribution of resources, it's probably more equality of opportunity, if anything. But it's more the social contract. So what is the social contract within the country which people buy into? Do they feel that they've got a equitable and just system in terms of opportunity and the distribution of resources? So what the US may consider equitable will be very different, let's say, what you'd find in Sweden or Denmark, for example. Now, we'll come back and look at acceptance of rights of others, and that's really sort of underpins the lessening things like which would be group grievances. So one of the things we can see which is rising in many of the developed countries today is the level of group grievances. And so acceptance of the rights of others, if you've got an acceptance there, goes a long way towards lessening those group grievances, which in the long run spill over into conflict.
You do talk in your book about religion and peace. You take issue, though, with the idea that religious conflict is always essentially religious. What we perceive to be religious conflict, you question whether it is always religious.
This is right. Quite often there are factors within a society which are lightning rods for conflict. And if we look over the last decade, we could see radical interpretations of the Sunni religion being lightning rods for conflict. And also you'll see ethnic divisions as another thing which is lightning rods for conflicts as well. But if we look deeper, you'll find that religion's never the only factor. You'll find that quite often there's 4 or 5 other factors which are involved in the conflict. And that can come back to these group grievances, which are economic. They can come back to state-sponsored terror on the citizens. They come back to a whole range of different factors which fall in. So quite often you'll find that religion will be something which then will be taken and utilised in conflicts, but it's just seldom the single cause of a conflict, because you can find from every country which is fighting over something religious, you'll find another country where it's not, with the very, very similar groupings of the same religions. So it's Sunni and Shiite. A lot of people think if they're ever together, they fight. But it's not true. You've got a whole range of countries in the Middle East which have got the same makeup of Shia and Sunni as what you had, let's say, in Iraq or Syria.
And just finally, you also challenge a bit of our thinking on the question of terrorism? Because these days we often think of terrorism as religiously inspired, but you say there's an economic impetus for terrorism as well. There's an economic aspect of it. What is that?
So, look, the good news on terrorism is over the last 6 years, each year it's been decreasing. And so in 2020, it's the same again. So the back of ISIS is broken in the Middle East, but there's still pockets of it still active in places like particularly Syria and a little bit of it in Iraq. But it is growing when we move over to the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. Now, if we start to look into there, what you find there's a number of conditions which have come together to cause it. So the first thing is you can come back and you can see this is economic. They're also some of the more highly stressed countries for water and food. You also got populations which are growing. In the next 30 years, a lot of those countries will double their population, some of the highest population growth rates in the world. You've got very, very weak central governments, which means you end up with the areas where these Islamic groups can take foothold and thrive. And then also, as you start the conflicts increase, that also now impacts the economies. The economies turn down. People get more concerned over livelihoods, and they're more likely to join something radical looking for change.
Steve Killelea, founder of the Institute for Economics and Peace.